Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Flight. Hope you're doing great today. This video will walk through some concepts that deal with the broader environment in which we do business. So again, this is an extension of the planning model that we looked at earlier, where when we start to do strategy and we start to think about where the company's going and where like growth opportunities are going to be, when we look at and consider how we're going to create value for the customer, first couple steps deal with looking at our mission and our goal, but then also the environment in which we do business. So this series of videos has kind of given an overview of that using the SWOT analysis. Then we looked at, or kind of extended that a little bit to look at what we call the micro market environment, where we look at kind of the pieces that are closest to the customer, or the pieces that affect the customer most closely. And those would be like our function, the company's strengths, competitors, our partners that we do business with, and the physical environment. After that, though, we have something that is focused on kind of the broader space. Okay, so again, remember we have this planning model that we've looked at, and I'm, kind of go back and just refresh your memory that when we're in this planning model, there are a lot of different ways we can, do an evaluation. The SWOT analysis, one of which, and again, we've looked at the micro environment, which are elements that are closest to the customer. Now we want to go out further and look at elements that are further away from the customer, but still impact our ability to serve and create value for them. Now, each one of these that you see, culture, political, legal environment, demographics, the social environment, the economy, and technology, those all are things we might see in trends. So we do a trend analysis. A lot of times, these are the things we're measuring in a trend analysis. They're elements that move slowly and evolve over time, and affect us in a kind of a large way, or a big way. So we'll want to spend a little bit of time talking about each one of these. Again, if you're doing an environmental, sometimes we call this an environmental scan, when we're scanning the environment, but these are very broad kind of components of that analysis. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these, and we'll just kind of go around. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on all of them. We'll go deeper into a few of them, but all I'm doing is pulling out the key things that you should know, that you should really be keen on, as you get out of this material. And so when we talk about culture, we're talking about shared meanings, beliefs, morals, values, and customs of a group of people. This culture, these values, these morals, these beliefs are going to be communicated, and they're going to be displayed, okay, as the text suggests, through words, literature, and institutions. Okay, but again, a culture is a shared element. It's a shared concept among a group of people associated with beliefs, morals, values, and customs. Now, keep in mind that different groups of people have a different culture. They have different beliefs, they have different morals, they have different values, and they have different customs. Okay, so in order for us to really bring value to a group of people, we have to understand what that culture is. We also kind of have to have this idea that cultures evolve a little bit. Cultures may transform a little bit, but cultures are distinct. And so, again, we need to understand the customer and the markets and the groups of people buying our product. So it's important for us to kind of get this concept down. There are actually many ways we can look at culture, but kind of from a geospatial consideration, kind of a geopolitical line, if you think of a country that is a unique and specific state, And we could also look at what's called a region or regional culture within a country. Okay, and there's probably other deviations too, but I think the key point here is to understand that culture can be defined at different levels, right? And different levels of abstraction. So at a country level, we have some terms that are good to know. One is nationalism. So nationalism is outcome, and these are marketing terms more specifically. So, and we measure nationalism actually in marketing. Nationalism is when you are and you demonstrate a pride in your national culture, right? So when you see like things buy American, this product was American produced in America, sorry, and so you should buy it. That's kind of like demonstrating a pride in your home country, which can be kind of extrapolated to suggest pride in your culture. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly valid human element. So I mean, people have this feeling for pride all over the world, regardless of what country you live in. There's people have pride from where they come. Okay, evolving definitions of country can exist if there's a lot of immigration and emigration and shifting elements. So there is a culture of a country. As new people come into that culture, the culture is changed a little bit. Maybe not a lot, but a little bit. And another example in marketing specifically of how we think of country culture or how we measure it might be something called individualism and collectivism. Now, these are dynamics of a culture, and this is just one example of a dynamic of a culture. In an individualistic culture, it means that people feel strongly about doing things on their own, that they're they have a greater sense of self reliance. Whereas in a collectivist culture, there's more sense of family together. We'll do this as a community or a communal element, where we don't rely on just ourselves, we rely on everybody collectively. So those are just some examples and ideas of cultural country culture. You can also have regional culture as well. And again, there are different levels of abstraction. Within a country, especially a large country like the United States or China or Soviet Union, Canada. I mean, there are lots of really big countries geographically speaking. Within these countries, there are pockets of people, and these pockets of people have their own local culture or regional culture, right? So now this is important because if you're, again, delivering value, you want to, be careful about like, okay, I could create the same product for everybody, or I could manipulate and change my product a little bit by region to reflect local culture. Okay, so that's kind of the idea that you want to go with. All right. So we'll talk about culture a little bit later when we talk about consumer behavior. There's something that you'll learn called Hofstede's cultural dimensions, and again, it's something we look at in consumer behavior, but it's also a way we can measure differences between people and people's cultures through, again, it's called Hofstede's cultural dimensions, and we'll look at that later on in another video. Okay, so another area, demographics. Demographics are characteristics that we use to define or describe people. And it's something that we use, again, as a descriptive tool, not really a predictive tool, but a descriptive tool in which we can describe consumers and customers and people, right? So demographics, they tend to be focused on things like age and gender and income level and things like that. Demographics, again, they are descriptive. They don't really necessarily tell us how someone's going to behave They just tell us about the person we're investigating. Okay, so we're going to talk about demographics a lot later too, but remember there are things like age, gender, family size, relationship status, all these kind of things, ethnicity, income levels, occupations, education, those types of things. There are other characteristics that we look at that you might throw into a demographic category. Social classes, habits, patterns, purchase histories, activities, interests, and opinions. Those are a little bit deeper. Those are more psychological. In fact, we have a whole group of psychological traits that we measure as well, which kind of start to extend outside of demographics, but things like attitude, self-image, personalities, aspirations, and so forth. So again, this kind of idea of demographics is kind of a research thing. It's like we want to describe our customers. At some point, though, we also want to understand how and why they behave. So demographics by themselves don't do that. You have to add to demographics other things like these psychological traits. Another thing that we can talk about, when we talk about demographics, sometimes we talk about something called generational cohorts. So a generational cohort is when you have a group of people who, generally speaking, this group of people is roughly the same in the same age group, but more importantly, they have a shared experience that they have lived through. And as a result of having that common shared experience, they have similar consumption habits. They have similar purchase habits because of how they were framed or how they were aged, I guess, if you will. So we have, again, some examples here. Generation Alpha. And their names change a little bit here depending on how old they are, how new they are. Generation Alpha is a very new name. And so 2010 to 2025, people who were born in those ranges, we think are going to be called Generation Alphas. There's Generation Zs, Gen Ys, Gen Xers, Baby Boomers, and there are ones before Baby Boomers too, as well. The key here, though, is that these folks are going to purchase products kind of in a way that is framed based on their experience. So think about Gen Ys or Gen Alphas here. These folks who are these young folks who are just born and are being born now. One of the big elements in their kind of consumption pattern, especially the ones who were born in 2010 to what 2018 or whatever, they're going to start to consume products based on the pandemic. And that's a big deal. It's also called the Great Screen Age because everybody in this age group has a ton of screen time. That's like a big part of their existence. Political extremism is like what they're growing into. Share ride, shared economies, social inequity, monetized influencers. These are all things that they are growing into that exist while they're forming their consumption patterns. So you kind of see how like what they're living through is going to shape how they purchase products. Gen Zs, we have these other generational elements as well. We've got to pull up all of them here for you. You can pause this video and read this if you want. Gen Zs, growing up in the internet kind of age, like they never knew life without the internet, for instance. Socially networking, they're very experience oriented over materialistic, kind of goals. Mobile digitals, they've had recessions. Those are the things that are going to shape them. Gen Yers, think about Gen Ys. This generational cohort lived through the end of the Cold War. That was a big deal with nuclear arms races. the advent of the VHS and the DVD, the fall of the Soviet Union, the USSR. Those are all big world events that shaped how they buy things. Um, right, Gen Xers, baby boomers, again, just kind of go through this. You can look at these. Gen Xers experienced what we're experiencing to a great degree now, or later here in the early 2020s, where where you have potentially high unemployment and potentially high inflation. It's called stagflation. That was a big deal in the early 80s, right? Baby boomers were born largely right after World War II for actually a long period of time, and they experienced enormous growth in the economy. And so their purchase patterns are kind of that way. That's the way they do things. Okay, so these, we're talking about demographics. That's what this is all about. Age and, kind of when people are born as a group also lends itself to kind of culture and kind of the motivation behind buying. And so that's where we want to eventually get to when we talk about demographics and kind of the profile of a customer. Okay. All right. Moving on. We got to move on. We could talk about this for a long time. Social trends. So there are all kinds of social trends that we look at, and we look at ones that are going to impact how people buy as well. Just kind of like those big events that we're talking about for the cohorts. We want to talk about 5 trends that are really, really big. You might not think of them initially, but they're going to impact how people function, how people live, right? And so let's talk a little bit about these. And I want you to know these. So again, memorize these, remember what these are. One trend is something called time compression, and this idea that there's never a downtime. If you can think about, like, a long time ago, you get up in the morning and there'd be the newspaper and you'd see the news from the day before. And then next day you'd wake up, the newspaper, you'd see the news from the day before. And then we started having TV where you could watch the nightly news, and at 5 or 6 in the evening, you could watch news about what happened today. What happened today? Well, let's watch the news and see what happened. So went from like a day's worth of news to half a day's worth of news, and now we have 24/7 news. So in other words, if something happens, we literally know within a minute or two, all the way around the world, that that event happened. If something like if a war breaks out, or if there's a hurricane, or an earthquake and a tsunami, if there's somebody dies or something happens, we know within minutes around the world that that event happened. So now, in other words, there's no downtime. We're always on. There's always a filter of news. And some people find this addictive. This is like an issue where people can't resist looking at their news feed on their social medias or whatever it is, or their news source, right? So that's that, and whether it's problematic or not, it can be a challenge. Number 2, mental health, anxiety, defining happiness, and people's coping abilities. So how people are mentally is dramatically changed and is changing more and more. And one of the challenges with this trend, with anxiety, with social kind of interactions, is this idea of being able to cope or deal with with the world around them. Some people would argue that we are losing our ability to deal with or cope with environmental, psychological, social change. So in other words, if somebody says something you don't like, it's a trigger. Well, That term trigger is very new. It's a very new concept. In the past, somebody said something or you heard something that you didn't like. Okay, people didn't really, react kind of emotionally. I mean, they kind of dealt with it. They dealt with it psychologically. And that dealing with or coping ability to internalize something that might not be great, but then move forward. That's a thing that we're I don't know whether we are losing the ability to do it or whatever, but that's a challenge. Okay, us versus them, tribalism, social and political polarization is a big issue. So again, it's easy to see examples in the political world and maybe even in a demographic social world, but this idea that we group together and there's this polarity where groups can't seem to find similarities with each other or accept each other. So that's a big challenge. That's a big social trend we're dealing with. Evolved social connections, interactions, interpersonal role definitions. So this idea then of the connected world, your network and your role in your network is a big trend, in a lot of ways, a very positive thing. But again, being able to define yourselves within the context of others is a bit of a challenge in the digital world. And so that's something that we're dealing with. Another big issue, and this is the last one, I wanted to highlight 5 things that we need to know about as marketers. These are big, big, big things. All of these, we need to be aware of these as marketers, as business people in the world today. This idea of what is real, what is authentic, what is true versus not. And this is going to become much more of, it's certainly an ethical issue, an ethical dilemma. But when we start doing artificial intelligence and machine learning, and that we take this further, we take those concepts further, knowing what a human created versus what a machine created, being able to find those two things is this state of true versus not true, or reality versus virtualness. So metaverse life, living in a metaverse, defining what reality is, those are all enormously ethical issues and concepts that we have to deal with. So moving forward, again, just kind of, I know there's a lot here of depth, but these are things that, again, as marketers view the world around them, we need to be kind of aware of. Okay, so technological advances. Again, remember, we're kind of just going around. There are 6 different things here. Technological advances. That is, when we create new products, we create innovations. Technology impacts all parts of marketing, everything that we do, from the new products that we create or have and offer, new forms of communication for sure, new retail channels, new ways to get the product and our value to others. This kind of evolving role of mobile digital is always going to be with us. And again, just kind of think about when a new innovation is dealt with, is created, how that impacts all the other things that we do. I mentioned artificial intelligence, but robotics, the Internet of Things, where computers talk to each other and they have a world of themselves. I mean, we think of ourselves as having our world where people talk to people. Well, machines talk to machines in their world. And it's happening kind of in a parallel sense to what we're doing right now. But that's there and that's now. We have the digital world where, again, computers talk to each other versus kind of what we're doing. And that's something that we need to kind of think about and move forward with. Second to last area would be our economic situation, or the global economic, macroeconomic conditions that we kind of live in. We might think of this as kind of the big market movers: inflation, recession, things like consumer confidence, monetary and physical policy. So if you take your economics classes, especially macroecon, think about the big terms you learned in that class, and all of those are going to impact kind of what we do. We can break it down for our consumers and think about like our consumers' disposable income, how much money they make, all of these things. So gross income is what the amount of money you take in from your salary or your job. Disposable income is how much money you have after paying certain required payments like taxes. After you pay taxes, then you have a certain amount of money disposed at your disposal. After that, you have to pay for things you need to live, like your rent, your utility bills, your food bills. After your life sustaining elements are paid for, you have what we call discretionary income, which you can save, which is a good thing. You can also take that money and buy things you like or you want, not things you need necessarily, but things you want, right? So after necessities, after taxes, you have those things. So let's think about then, if we're going to talk about like where people, the income they have and kind of the economic world around us. Consumer confidence is a big deal. How much money you make is a big deal. Whether, if you're in an inflationary period of time where you got cost of living is going up, whether you're in a growth period or a recession, those are all things we monitor. Those are all things that we look at. When we talk about income, again, this is just a screenshot. You can pause it if you want. We should know in each of our market segments where we have consumers buying our product, how much money do our consumers make? How much money, if I sell a product, how much money, what's the household income for a typical customer of mine? Is that growing? Is it shrinking? Is it something that is dynamic? That's something that we certainly need to know. We want to know about, as we talk about the economic pressures of the macro environment. Okay, and the last piece, it's going to be the political and legal environment. So these are regulatory things. So like when you do when you run a business, you have to pay taxes, you have to follow law, you have to know what that law is, we have to follow regulations, we have to we can't do anything that's going to be bad for the consumer or bad for competition. So there's all kinds of laws out there. Now, in some cases, those laws become more strict. So that's a period of regulation. When an industry is regulated, it means the laws are stricter and there are more rules to follow. As you can imagine, regulation slows down growth. Deregulation is the opposite of that. If you have a business or you run a business where the laws are being lessened or eliminated, then that's called deregulation. And in times like that, then the industry grows. So there's kind of this back and forth about regulation and deregulation. Regulations, laws, and things like that help protect competition, right? So fair competition is protected by laws that make sure that companies kind of follow the same rules. Regulations also help protect the consumer and help protect their consumer rights and such like that. So when you regulate something, you're doing it to make fair competition and to, again, protect the consumer. So that's super important to remember, to know about. Just remember, though, the flip side of this is when you regulate something, it limits or slows down growth in the industry. So if there's a heavily regulated industry, new companies don't want to get into that. New people don't want to get into or start doing business in a heavily regulated environment. So as you can imagine, it limits the amount of growth that happens in that. So a lot of times, if you want to spur an economy or if you want to grow an economy, the government, the politicians will deregulate an industry. And if they deregulate an industry, take rules away, then it means that it will grow. And that's one of the side effects of that. Okay, so wow, there's a lot in this area. Okay, so let's review, do a progress check. Let's review kind of what has been in this topic. Again, there's been a lot here. You can go into a lot of depth, but if you're going to do a real solid trend analysis, you're going to cover these areas pretty deeply. Okay, so this is not a quick and easy exercise. This is kind of a long-term thing. So think and remember what those 6 macro environmental factors are. We had this idea of culture, regional country culture. Okay, we talked about demographics, very specifically cohorts, age cohorts, demographic cohorts is something that we talked about. Understand how they're devised and kind of why they exist. Okay, we talked about 5 distinct social trends that are really important. Remember what those are. Okay, be able to talk about each one of those 5. Okay, we briefly talked about the economy, macro elements like recessions, growth, inflation. You can talk about, we'll talk later when we do business or international business, we'll talk about GDPs and stuff like that. Incomes, when we talk about the economy, like disposable, gross, discretionary income from our consumers. We talked about that, what those are. Then finally, we walked into this idea of political and legal evaluations of kind of what's going on, what the trends are, and we talked about regulated and deregulated industries. So again, there's a lot here. Most of it's pretty straightforward. I mean, there aren't really any big surprises, I don't think. But you should know at least something about each one of these 6 kind of areas, and understand that these are macro effects on markets that we serve, and kind of go from there. So, hey, enjoy reading the text and enjoy watching this video. Let me know if you have any questions, and otherwise, you have a great day.